particular sandcastle, right? It has to be the case then, and this is where it gets genius, we immediately jump into the abyss. There is no other step. You jump straight into the abyss, right? It is always already immediately possible that any possible configuration of sandcastle is inherent within each individual grain of sand. Each individual, this becomes almost Leibnizian. So for those of you who understand Leibniz's monads, and I have a few Leibnizian crackheads that follow me, I don't want to go off on a tangent in that, but this is almost Leibnizian. Each individual grain of sand, then, as a property of the thing, sandcastle, always already has the possibility of occupying any conceivable position in the thing that is the final sandcastle, right? So that the final sandcastle as thing, at its core, the core of the thing, is the possibility that the sandcastle could in fact be created, right? It's always already possible that that thing, the sandcastle, could be created. And how was it created? One, by the artist, and two, by the artist's genius, the artist's ability to transform the properties into the work of art, right? So that the work of art is the relationship between the properties that have gathered themselves around the core of the thing, which is itself always already infinitely possible. So hopefully that helps in that regard. We just did the first bit, right? It was a very difficult concept for me to try and conceptualize and then to be able to describe, but I think it's a gross generalization, but it's good enough to get you to have a better understanding of the relationship. And what's important in that example is to understand the function of at least three things, right? The first thing is the property. The second thing is the core of the thing. And the third thing is the always already, right? So the properties, okay, sand. The thing, sandcastle. The always already, the possibility that that sandcastle was even possible, right? The always already given fact that the sandcastle was a possibility. So the characteristics, however, are called here goes a hard one, sum be bikota. Sorry if I brutalized that, right? That which has always turned up already along with the given core and occurs along with it, right? Very difficult conception, but it makes sense now, right? The always already is contiguous, right? It exists simultaneously as a possibility with the thing. You can't have the conception of a thing that can't exist, and I gave you an example of that. So the example that contemporary philosophers, analytic philosophers, sort of borrow this idea, and they'll talk about the 50-foot woman, right? There is a sense in which the 50-foot woman is possible. There's no contradiction in the conceptualization of the 50-foot woman. Insofar as we talk about the conceptualization of the 50-foot woman, it is certainly possible. There's no contradiction in there. So there is a sense in which the universe is always already conditioned for the possibility of that existence, of that specific existence, right? So in an even more profound sense, I like to think, and this is a tangent and I'll stop here, I like to think about this, right? I think about this ridiculous crap all the time. I wish I would think about something else, but this is the type of crap I'm thinking about. If you ascribe to evolutionary principles, we as pre-human beings crawled out of the sludge. All of the constituents for the iPad existed within the earth at the moment that we crawled out of the sludge. The pre-human. So that all of the constituents for the iPad were there, obviously, because we didn't, they were there. We needed to have technology to arrange the properties of the iPad so that the iPad exists. But all of the potential component parts and functions and material and matter that was needed to create the iPad was there from the time that we crawled out of the sludge. What I think is just overwhelmingly amazing is to conceptualize what exists in the earth right now, in the universe right now, technologically speaking, that we can't even conceptualize yet, that will one day in fact be fact. it takes a very, very perceptive mind, right? And we're not just talking about scientists, we're talking about also artistic, right? It takes a very, very perceptive mind to see the possibilities that don't yet exist, right? In terms of epistemologically, they've always existed from the beginning of time, obviously, because it's always already, right? The individual who has sufficient sort of perceptive abilities, I don't know if you're gifted with this, or I don't think you develop it per se. I don't know if you can train people to see like this. I see the world in this way, in a sense, to greater or lesser degrees. But the idea is, individual human beings, some of us, have the ability to see things, not in a necessarily a literal sense, maybe in a more metaphorical sense, can see things where there isn't a condition for even its conceptualization yet. And it's those individuals that really learn how to manipulate the external world. And then, in a sense, I've seen Will Smith discuss this before, and I think it's pretty interesting. Will Smith never talked about how it's done. That's the whole point of my lecture series, is, Will, thanks for getting the population's palate wet. Now it's time to talk about how you transform the world with your mind, right? You have to have the type of mind that can see the possibility, right? And you have to be able to see this possibility independent to the existence of the actual thing. The thing isn't yet in fruition. And that's what the artist does. The artist, in a very literal sense, brings the possibility into the world through art. Right? That's a very important point. That's a very important point, right? The artist can see it, has a complete understanding of what it is, it as a thing, and brings this thing into existence by arranging properties in such a manner that the properties and the arrangement of such produce this thing in the world that was otherwise not here, right? So, very important. So, my example is this. It's sort of like the sandcastle example. It's just a very gross example. To be honest with you, any visual depiction of this fails because it's so abstract, and it's supposed to be so abstract, that the instance that I give you a visual representation of what Heidegger's talking about, I've immediately done a disservice to his conceptualization, but there's no other way to do it, right? If it's just purely sound, or if it's just purely thought, it's too abstract. It would never be palatable for educational purposes. The idea is I have to make it palatable, because this is a lecture series on aesthetics. So recognize that this example is, like my sandcastle example, is a humongous generalization, but it isn't so much that we need to be exact now. What we need to do, this is an introduction to aesthetics, what we need to do is just understand the idea. So that here is an arrangement of 4 geometrical figures. We have a square, we have an equilateral triangle, we have a square, and we have a rectangle. And we recognize that these 4 objects then have the possibility of being many things, right? That these traits, these properties, can lead to a thing. They can point, right? They can point to a thing. But it is the way in which these things are themselves assembled. He said, looking back at the earlier quote, they are its properties. A thing is that around which the properties have assembled. So if we look at these properties, these 4 things, these 4 geometrical figures, we recognize that we can arrange them in such that we have the depiction of a very trivial house. This is the extent of my artistic ability. So I've actually created something in this world, so my life was meaningful, and the meaning that I brought to the world was this little house. Right? So I created a little house out of 4 objects. And you think to yourself, how profoundly trite. It is rather trite. But the idea is this, right? In a very serious sense, it's just the recognition that it's at least possible, right? I've taken 4 geometric figures, I've arranged them in such a manner that those 4 geometric figures bring into existence the representation of a house, the visual representation of a house. The thing, being the house, was always already possible in the existence of these objects. And then what you can do, like with the sandcastle, is you can get deeper and deeper and deeper and more abstract, right? Well, it's not just that the sandcastle is itself the thing, because in fact the